The bison didn't charge. It didn't trample. It simply stood in the middle of the HOA's precious botanical walking trail, chewing cud with the indifference of a beast that knew it didn't need to prove anything. Nearby, children screamed and scattered like pigeons, yoga mats flew through the air, and a woman holding a green smoothie dropped it mid-sip, watching in horror as the massive animal flicked its tail and walked straight toward the HOA gazebo. My bison, on my land near their park. I didn't break a single law. And as HOA President Karen screamed into her phone for animal control, her voice shrill with panic, I leaned back in my rocking chair with my morning coffee and said the words I'd been dying to deliver for months. So, about that fence. But to understand how we got here, you'd have to rewind 6 months. That's when it all began, with a fence, a fine, and a woman who seriously underestimated how stubborn a rancher can be. It all started when I finished installing the new fence along the southern side of my property. I wasn't doing it for looks. I was doing it because a few of my steers had gotten curious about the neighbors' flower beds and decided pansies made excellent salad. So I upgraded to a proper farm-grade post and wire setup, reinforced with a second layer of mesh to keep my livestock where they belonged. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid, safe, and legal. Or so I thought. The very next morning, I found a note taped to my gate. In all caps, printed on thick cardstock, was a formal letter from the HOA. According to them, my fence violated several community policies regarding height, material, color, and, this part really got me, visual tranquility. Apparently, the reflective metal on the wire disrupted the pastoral flow of the neighborhood and had been a source of complaints. That was HOA speak, for Karen didn't like it. She lived across the greenbelt in a faux Tuscan villa that came with a daily attitude and a ridiculous garden gnome collection. And somehow, she'd made it her life's mission to micromanage everyone within a 500-foot radius. I tried to be reasonable. I called the number listed on the notice and asked to speak to someone on the board. Instead, I got routed straight to Karen's voicemail, where she'd already prepared a message detailing her hours of availability and preferred method of contact. Email only, no phone calls, and absolutely no drop-ins. So I emailed. I explained the fence was well within the boundaries of my property, matched all county codes, and was erected for safety due to the presence of livestock. I even included the permit number. 3 days later, I got a reply. It was one sentence long. Your fence does not align with our community's aesthetic values. Please remove it by Friday or face penalties. I ignored it. Friday came and went. The fence stood. And then came the fine. A whopping $10,000. 10 grand for a fence that wasn't on their property, didn't obstruct any public view, and met every legal requirement. I was stunned. At first, I thought it had to be some clerical error. But no, attached to the fine was a 60-page PDF outlining the alleged violations, complete with photos taken from odd angles and bullet points about harmony, elegance, and material incongruity. I drove straight to the HOA office and asked for a meeting. Karen wasn't there, of course. Just a nervous receptionist and a junior board member named Steve, who looked like he regretted ever volunteering. He tried to explain it was out of his hands, that the president had insisted on the fine being enforced, and if I had any issues, I should take them up at the next HOA board meeting. I did just that. When I showed up, the room was packed with retirees, overly interested neighbors, and a few smug faces I recognized from around the block. Karen sat at the head of the table like some queen on her plastic throne, wielding a printed agenda and a silver bell she rang any time someone raised their voice. I presented my case calmly, showing all the legal documents, the livestock safety regulations, even aerial maps showing that not a single part of the fence encroached on common property. Karen smiled, nodded, and then said, "It's not about legality, it's about community standards." The board voted 4-1 to uphold the fine. The one no vote was Steve, who avoided eye contact with me on the way out. I walked out of that meeting vibrating with frustration. $10,000 over a fence built to keep animals in. A fence no one could even see unless they were intentionally snooping. And all because the self-proclaimed protector of neighborhood serenity didn't like seeing rural functionality from her wine cellar. I could have taken it to court, sure. I could have spent months fighting over paperwork, arguing clauses, and dealing with more nonsense. But I had a better idea. That night, I sat on my back porch with a bourbon in hand and stared out over the pasture. The air was still, the stars clear, and the silence interrupted only by the occasional moo from a cow settling down. Then it hit me. If Karen thought a fence was disruptive, what would she think of what the fence was for? That was when I called my cousin Earl in Montana. Earl runs a bison preserve. He's got the permits, the expertise, and more importantly, the hookups. I told him what happened. He laughed so hard he choked on his chew. And then he said, "You want some buffalo? I'll send you the tamest ones we got." Of course, I didn't just throw bison into my field without checking the legal side. I knew what I was doing. I spent the next few weeks researching wildlife permits, checking containment protocols, and upgrading my property boundaries with steel-reinforced gates and solar-powered alarms. I met with the local agricultural extension office, who confirmed that as long as I had proper fencing, signage, and care plans, I could house bison on private land. I didn't tell a soul, not even my closest neighbors. I wanted the surprise to land just right. Meanwhile, the HOA kept sending reminders. Pay the fine. Remove the fence. Submit an apology letter if I wanted to avoid further penalties. I smiled at every email. I even framed one. Then, one brisk morning, as dew still clung to the grass and the sun peeked over the hills, the truck arrived. A long silver trailer backed into my property, and out stepped 3 adult bison and 2 calves. Their hooves hit the ground like thunder. Their size was majestic, their movement deceptively graceful. My dog took one look and ran for the barn. By noon, the bison were grazing peacefully, adjusting to their new home. I had a high-grade feeding station set up, watering troughs installed, and clear signs warning anyone not to approach. And wouldn't you know it, by evening, Karen showed up, wearing oversized sunglasses and a tracksuit, flanked by 2 other board members. She stared at the bison like they were UFOs. "What is the meaning of this?" she snapped. I leaned on the fence and said, "Livestock. My new herd. Perfectly legal." Her jaw worked like she was trying to chew anger into something edible. She threatened animal control. I told her they were already notified and approved. She called them anyway. They confirmed everything I said. She stormed off screaming about disease, danger, property value, and chaos. I went back to my porch and watched the bison wander toward the back fence, peacefully munching, unaware of the storm they'd just started. His wasn't revenge for the fence. This was a statement. If you're going to fine me for what contains the animal, you better be prepared for the animal itself. And this was just the beginning. Because I had a plan, and Karen's reign of pettiness was about to come face to face with prairie justice. The sunrise cast a golden hue across the pasture as the bison stirred from their sleep. There was something majestic about watching these creatures stretch, huff, and start their slow march toward the far end of my property. I stood there with a cup of coffee in hand, feeling a strange combination of peace and anticipation. I knew today wouldn't stay quiet for long. Word had begun to spread. The local mail carrier had snapped a photo of one of the bison standing by the split-rail section of fence, and within hours it was making the rounds on Facebook with the caption, "HOA has a new neighbor, and he's massive." It didn't take long for Karen to escalate things. The day after the photo surfaced, a letter was taped, no, practically stapled, to my front gate. It was thicker than the HOA's monthly newsletter and written in her favorite flavor of passive-aggressive formal language. According to her, my property had become a regional wildlife hazard and was causing emotional distress among residents who feared for their pets and children. She demanded immediate removal of the animals or else she would explore legal avenues for community protection. I read it twice, then placed it on the fridge next to a magnet that said, "Good luck with that." Later that afternoon, Karen organized a gathering near the HOA clubhouse to voice concerns over what she now called the buffalo threat. Residents showed up in folding chairs, some with snacks like they were expecting entertainment. Karen stood in front of the small crowd wearing a tan visor and waving papers in the air. She claimed she had received calls from worried mothers, joggers, and even a man who said his golden retriever refused to go near the back fence since the animals arrived. She cited imaginary statistics about bison charging through fences, and referenced a YouTube video that apparently showed one trampling a tent at a national park. But my property was still mine. Every inch of it, and I'd followed every rule down to the last paragraph. What Karen didn't realize, or maybe she did, but refused to acknowledge, was that the fence she hated so much was now officially designated for containing wildlife under agricultural regulation. That meant her original fine had become, at best, a weak punch thrown at someone wearing armor. Her entire campaign was losing steam, and she knew it. Still, she tried to keep control. The next morning, a representative from the HOA board named Lydia stopped by under the guise of a courtesy inspection. She was polite, nervous even, and carried a clipboard that looked more like a prop than a legal document. I walked her around the property, pointed out the reinforced corners, the double-gate lock system, and the state-required signage. When she asked if I had a containment plan in case of an escape, I pulled out a laminated folder containing all the permits, safety procedures, and even the contact number for a licensed bison wrangler 3 towns over. She looked almost relieved. I had a feeling not everyone on the board was thrilled about being dragged into Karen's personal feud. Later that week, I got a surprise visit from a local reporter. Apparently, someone had tipped off the press about the ongoing saga, and now they wanted to do a human interest story. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to turn this into a spectacle. But then I realized that the HOA had been quietly feeding their version of events to the community, painting me as some rogue rancher unleashing beasts for revenge. The truth deserved a voice too. I agreed to the interview. The piece aired 2 nights later. It was light-hearted, cheeky even. They showed footage of the bison grazing peacefully, highlighted the legality of my permits, and ended with a slow-motion clip of one calf playfully running near a fence line. The reporter described me as the cowboy who fenced the law with logic, and the whole thing ended with a chuckle-worthy line about how sometimes the best way to shut down nonsense is with a little grass-fed dignity. Karen was not amused. The next HOA newsletter arrived with an emergency section titled Public Safety Update. It featured a hilariously dramatic article about the risks of sizable untamed wildlife and warned parents to keep children away from the back greenbelt. One paragraph even suggested that nearby residents consider motion sensor sprinklers to deter the animals, as if bison were no different than raccoons. I nearly choked on my coffee reading it. By now, other neighbors were beginning to pick sides. Some thought the bison were a menace. Others were secretly thrilled to have something exciting to talk about. One couple even asked if they could host a photo shoot for their kid's birthday with the bison in the background. I politely declined, didn't want to start a zoo, but I appreciated the gesture. The mood was shifting, and Karen felt it. She responded by organizing a petition. She went door to door with a clipboard, trying to collect signatures to have the animals removed. What she didn't count on was that many people were tired of her power trip. A few politely declined. Others flat out refused. One neighbor told me she asked if he was concerned for his dog's emotional stability. He replied, "My dog sleeps 22 hours a day and hasn't even noticed the bison." Only a few actually signed, mostly the HOA loyalists and one guy who Karen bakes cookies for every Christmas. In retaliation, Karen began pushing for a new policy at the next board meeting. Something about redefining hazardous agricultural activity within a set perimeter of common areas. I knew it was aimed squarely at me. But again, her timing was terrible. The very next day, a group of school children visited the local farmers' market and saw the bison from afar. Their teacher took a picture and posted it online with a caption thanking local ranchers for maintaining healthy ecosystems. It got picked up by the local nature group and shared over 1,000 times. Karen's campaign to label the bison as monstrous threats now had to compete with school kids calling them majestic. The board meeting was an awkward affair. Karen tried to deliver her motion with her usual self-righteous tone, but this time there was pushback. One member asked why the HOA was spending so much time on a single neighbor's livestock when real maintenance issues were being ignored. Another said she was tired of being dragged into a feud that seemed personal. The vote was postponed. Later that night, I was out near the fence checking the electric sensors when I noticed something odd. The gate that faced the jogging trail had been left unlatched. That was strange. I'd secured it myself earlier. I double-checked the lock, then pulled the security camera footage. What I saw wasn't just suspicious, it was infuriating. Around 5:47 p.m., an HOA landscaper had wandered up to the gate with a weed trimmer, opened the latch to pass through, and walked into the greenbelt to clear some brush. But when he came back out, he forgot to close it properly. He didn't even check it. The gate swung open just a bit and stayed that way for hours. If one of the bison had wandered in that direction, they could have easily walked straight into the jogging trail or, worse, the HOA park. My bison hadn't moved because they were too busy rolling in mud on the other side of the pasture. But the risk had been real. I didn't yell. I didn't call the HOA in a rage. I simply downloaded the footage, edited it for clarity, and saved it to a USB drive. The next time Karen accused me of negligence, I'd be ready. Because this wasn't just about fences or animals anymore. This was about control, accountability, and who got to dictate the rules when the rule-maker couldn't follow them herself. The bison were here to stay. But now, so was the truth. It was just after sunrise when my phone buzzed with a barrage of messages. At first, I figured someone was sharing another meme of Karen. Those had been floating around lately, especially the one with her holding a bullhorn labeled Buffalo. But this was different. One message from my neighbor Cole simply read, "Dude, your buffalo are in the park." I stood frozen on the porch, the coffee in my hand suddenly forgotten. For a split second, my heart sank. I raced down to the pasture, where sure enough, the main gate on the west side was wide open, and the bison were gone. Not all of them, just 2 adults and a calf. I followed the fresh hoof prints across the damp grass, past the trail line, straight into the shared HOA green space. And there they were. The calf was happily chasing butterflies near the edge of the park's swing set, while the 2 adults grazed calmly by the community fountain. It would have been picturesque if not for the screaming residents. One woman held her small dog like a shield. Another was on the phone with emergency services, yelling something about a buffalo stampede, which was hilarious considering the animals were moving slower than molasses uphill. I walked briskly toward them, staying calm, making no sudden movements. Years of working with animals had taught me panic never helps. What did help, however, was a 5-gallon bucket filled with sweet feed. I shook it gently and called out, and like obedient cows at dinner time, the bison began to plod toward me. Just as I got them halfway back across the field, a police cruiser pulled into the HOA lot, lights flashing but siren off. An officer stepped out, hands in the air, as if he were facing down armed fugitives. I quickly waved to get his attention and explained that the animals were mine, fully permitted and not aggressive. To his credit, he didn't escalate things. In fact, once the bison were back inside the fence, he looked more amused than concerned. He asked to see the permits, which I provided, and then he chuckled as he said, "You wouldn't believe the call we got. Lady said there were buffalo attacking children." One of the calmest situations I've ever responded to. Of course, that lady was Karen. She was across the field, arms folded, lips pursed so tightly they looked like they could pop off her face. As soon as the officer turned away, she marched over to me with steam practically pouring out of her ears. "This is it," she hissed, "you've crossed the line now." I kept my cool. I told her the gate had been tampered with. She called that an excuse. I said I had footage. That shut her up. Back at my house, I pulled up the footage on the monitor. At 4:16 a.m., just before dawn, someone had approached the gate from the Greenbelt side, outside the property. The video showed a person in a hoodie, carrying what looked like bolt cutters. They snipped the chain, lifted the latch, and disappeared into the dark. Less than 15 minutes later, the Bison wandered through the opening. The angle wasn't perfect, but I enhanced it enough to make out a few key details, like the HOA badge on the windbreaker. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but there was no denying the intruder wasn't random. Someone had intentionally opened that gate. I sent a copy of the video to the local sheriff's office and CC'd the HOA board. I didn't accuse anyone directly. I didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself. By that evening, word had spread and the drama went nuclear. At the emergency board meeting the next day, half the board looked like they'd aged 10 years. Steve, the only one who had voted against fining me originally, called the meeting to order. Karen sat silently, arms crossed, refusing to look up from her binder. When Steve played the video, gasps went around the room. Even Karen's closest supporter, a guy named Mark who'd always backed her motions, shook his head and muttered something under his breath. The sheriff didn't make any arrests that day, but he promised an investigation. The bolt cutters were still at the scene, which meant fingerprints were a possibility. I had no doubt they'd trace it back to someone with HOA access. That meant Karen or one of her inner circle. The weight of their carelessness was enormous. Had the Bison harmed someone, it could have turned into a disaster. But the real kicker was that it wasn't my security that failed. It was theirs. The next morning, local news showed up again. This time they weren't interested in a feel-good fluff piece. They were covering an act of sabotage that led to a public safety scare. Reporters stood by the Greenbelt Trail, pointing at the reinforced gate now secured with double chains and a digital lock system. Meanwhile, I gave a short interview, remaining composed and firm. I didn't take shots at Karen by name, but I did say, "It's one thing to dislike your neighbor. It's another thing to endanger people and animals to make a point." Within 2 days, the story had exploded on Reddit. The title of the post was simply, "HOA unleashes buffalo to prove a point, gets trampled by facts." It included screen grabs of the news coverage, Karen's ridiculous HOA newsletter warning about the buffalo apocalypse, and a side-by-side shot of the animals peacefully grazing. The comments section was ruthless. One said, "Karen wanted a peaceful neighborhood. Now she gets Jurassic Park." Another wrote, "You don't mess with a rancher's fence unless you want to meet the beef squad." The board was forced to hold another vote, this time to decide whether Karen should be temporarily suspended while the investigation continued. Despite her protests, the vote passed 3-2. Steve made a short speech about leadership needing to be accountable and the importance of not abusing community power for personal vendettas. Karen stormed out before the meeting ended, her chair scraping the floor behind her like a declaration of war. But even without her physically present, her influence lingered. Over the next week, someone began leaving anonymous notes in my mailbox. The first read, "We'll get rid of your pests one way or another." The second simply said, "Your animals aren't welcome here." I turned them over to the sheriff, who added them to the case. I installed more cameras, upgraded my fence sensors, and made it very clear to the board that if anything happened to those animals, I would pursue legal action to the fullest extent. Despite the tension, I noticed something else happening too. Neighbors began reaching out, not the loud ones, but the quiet majority who had stayed on the sidelines until now. One older man, George, came by with fresh eggs from his chickens and said, "Used to be this was all farmland. Glad to see someone bringing it back with pride." A family down the street waved and gave me a thumbs up while their kids pointed excitedly at the Bison from behind the fence. The tide was turning. Karen, however, wasn't finished. I could feel it. Even off the board, she had her loyalists, and something told me she wasn't the kind to accept defeat with grace. But for now, the animals were safe, the gate was sealed, and the truth had cracked her authority. She'd tried to sabotage me, but instead exposed her own recklessness. And the best part? The original $10,000 fine she tried to slap on me had just been called into question. My lawyer had filed an appeal with county oversight, citing harassment, improper enforcement, and retaliatory behavior. If it stuck, the HOA wouldn't just owe me an apology, they'd owe me a check. As I walked the pasture that night, I looked at the bison under the moonlight, solid, unbothered, symbolic. These weren't just animals anymore. They were resilience in fur. Karen had tried to force me into submission. Instead, she unlocked the gate to a reckoning. And something told me the wild part of the story had only just begun. It was just after midnight when the alarm on my phone buzzed, followed instantly by a notification from my security system. One of the motion detectors near the west gate had been triggered. I wasn't surprised, not after the last week's drama and the anonymous threats left in my mailbox. I'd expected someone to test my patience again. What I didn't expect was for it to be Karen herself. When I pulled up the live camera feed, there she was, crouched awkwardly by the gate, dressed in all black like a cartoon burglar. Her oversized sunglasses, worn even at night, glinted beneath the motion-activated floodlight. In one hand she held bolt cutters, in the other a flashlight with a shaking beam. For a moment I just stared at the screen in disbelief. The HOA's ex-president, self-declared defender of tranquility, was now attempting a midnight jailbreak on Buffalo. I stayed calm. I didn't run outside. I didn't even call the sheriff right away. First, I hit the record button. My cameras were already set to archive automatically, but I wanted a separate copy of this ridiculous scene. Karen struggled with the gate's double-chain system, clearly underestimating just how reinforced it had become. She huffed, tried to wedge the bolt cutters into the links, and let out a muffled curse when sparks flew and nothing gave. Then, to my absolute astonishment, she dropped the tools and climbed onto a nearby bench, one I had placed for guests during Bison tours. From there, she attempted to climb the fence itself. The bison, curious as always, began to approach. Not aggressively, not even particularly fast, just wandering slowly, heads bobbing, interested in the noise. Karen saw them and froze. Her arms windmilled slightly as she tried to decide whether to go up or down. One of the bison, the big male I'd named Dakota, let out a deep snort that echoed like a foghorn. Karen screamed. She fell backward off the bench, landing flat on her back in the dirt, her arms flailing like a flipped turtle. I couldn't believe what I was watching. I hit record again, just in case. By the time I called the sheriff, Karen had scrambled to her feet and was half running, half limping across the field, arms out for balance, shrieking into her phone. I didn't even need to guess who she was calling. But she was about to be very disappointed. When the deputies arrived, they took one look at my camera footage and immediately changed tone. Karen tried to spin it, of course, claimed she had come to inspect for safety, and that she'd noticed an improperly secured lock. But the footage clearly showed her snipping and tampering, not inspecting. The bolt cutters alone were damning. The sheriff asked her flatly why she hadn't called animal control if she was concerned. She stammered. She tried to redirect blame. She even mentioned mental anguish caused by the aggressive posture of the livestock, which made one deputy visibly roll his eyes. Karen was arrested for trespassing, attempted vandalism, and endangering wildlife. The charge of animal endangerment was particularly poetic given her months of fear-mongering over the bison. As the deputies led her to the cruiser, she screamed that she was saving the community from disaster, and that this isn't over. I watched her drive off in handcuffs with a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. It had taken months, but karma had finally answered, and it had horns. The fallout was swift. The next HOA board meeting was packed. Residents who'd never cared about the politics showed up in droves, many clutching printed copies of the newspaper article about Karen's arrest. She'd made front-page headlines for all the wrong reasons. One local blog dubbed her the Buffalo Bandit, and the photo of her on the ground, arms flailing, became a minor internet sensation. The board couldn't sweep it under the rug anymore. Her remaining supporters tried to stall, tried to claim due process, but it was no use. A formal vote was held. Karen was permanently removed from all HOA-related duties. Her access to official files, voting records, even the neighborhood newsletter was revoked. For the first time in years, she had no power to meddle. Meanwhile, my lawyer was having a field day. The video evidence, the previous threats, the failed gate sabotage, it all painted a perfect picture of harassment and misconduct. We filed a formal complaint with the county against the HOA, citing abuse of authority, false enforcement of code violations, and a coordinated attempt to sabotage my agricultural operation. The original $10,000 fence fine? Dismissed by the county with prejudice. But it didn't stop there. The county determined that the HOA had acted in bad faith, knowingly enforcing unenforceable fines and disregarding county agricultural exemptions. That meant restitution. A formal letter was sent to the board demanding repayment of legal fees, emotional distress damages, and loss of income caused by unnecessary delays in my livestock expansion. The total came to over $42,000. Steve, now the acting board president, called me personally. He apologized. Genuinely. He admitted that Karen had bullied most of them into compliance, and that he regretted not speaking up sooner. I believed him. And I told him I didn't want to see the HOA burned to the ground, I just wanted accountability. We negotiated. They paid the restitution. Publicly. At the next town meeting, a full statement was read, acknowledging their mistake and clearing my name entirely. With the drama behind me, I focused back on the Bison. Dakota, the big male, had become a local celebrity. Tour groups from nearby schools asked for educational visit. I hired a part-time guide to give tours and explain the role of bison in ecosystem restoration. I partnered with a local butcher for ethically harvested meat from another farm, not my bison, but similar breeds, and started selling bison jerky, lean meat, and even handcrafted leather goods. What started as revenge had grown into a full-fledged business, and I was proud of that. The fence, once hated, was now famous. Someone had spray-painted "Prairie Justice" on one of the crossbeams, and instead of washing it off, I carved it in with a branding tool. It stayed. People took selfies there. The HOA, now under better leadership, updated their rules to officially allow agricultural fencing on edge properties. They even asked me to help draft the new guidelines. I accepted, with one condition: that no board member could approve a fine without legal review if it involved farm property. They agreed. Karen, meanwhile, kept a low profile. Her house went up for sale a few weeks later. Rumor had it she was moving to a stricter gated community where she hoped to join a more professional HOA. I wished her well, from a distance. Her exit was quiet, without ceremony or even a word to her former loyalists. Just a moving truck, a for sale sign, and a distinct absence of glares across the greenbelt. I installed one final security measure before I fully moved on. A motion-activated audio message that played a recording whenever someone stepped too close to the pasture fence after dark. It simply said, in a calm voice, "You are now within proximity of protected livestock. Please turn back." Behind the message was the subtle sound of Dakota's snort. It was a deterrent, sure, but also a reminder. A reminder that the fence wasn't there to separate or intimidate. It was there to protect. And sometimes, the thing people fight hardest against ends up being the thing that holds the community together. That night, I sat on the porch again, bourbon in hand, watching the silhouettes of the bison move slowly across the moonlit field. The wind carried the distant sound of children playing near the park, laughter bouncing softly through the trees. No more sirens. No more threats. Just peace. Earned, not given. and as Dakota lumbered over, leaned against the fence, and looked at me with those deep, calm eyes, I nodded and said aloud to no one in particular, she should have just let me keep my fence.